Princess Anne has wrapped up her Australian tour in Brisbane, paying tribute to fallen servicemen and women at a Remembrance Day.
Before sunrise, a brief statement issued from Buckingham Palace sent a tremor through the nation. King Charles had delivered a sobering message concerning Princess Anne, one that carried implications far deeper than the royal household itself. What has unfolded within palace walls over the past weeks is darker, more complex, and more far-reaching than anyone outside could have anticipated. The unseen repercussions, the chapter the public was never intended to read. In the day that followed King Charles's grave declaration regarding Princess Anne's newly defined position, the country reacted with stunned restraint, a heavy silence filled with disbelief. Yet while the media dissected the visible impact, something else was quietly taking shape out of view. A far more fragile narrative was unraveling behind the sealed gates of Buckingham Palace. It was never meant for public eyes. Not a tale of tradition or titles, but of personal sacrifice and the irreversible cost of a decision powerful enough to mark the end of an era. Within the palace, the shift was immediate and unmistakable. Hallways once governed by routine and calm now echoed with hushed voices and urgent movement. Long-serving aides, veterans of more than one reign, exchanged looks that spoke volumes without a single word. They recognized the pattern instantly. Something fundamental had changed. They had witnessed this pattern before. Periods when the machinery of the monarchy quietly tightened its grip, preparing for change long before admitting it existed. Times when the crown, patient and relentless, positioned the future while the present still pretended everything was stable. The earliest signal of internal rupture surfaced late that same afternoon, when the king's private secretary urgently called a small circle of senior advisors into the blue drawing room, a chamber reserved for matters too sensitive for wider ears. What made the gathering unusual wasn't the hour, it was the tone. This was not strategic forecasting. These were directives, swift, decisive, and directly born from the king's announcement. Briefing files were rewritten on the spot to reflect a transformed order. Princess Anne's duties were no longer auxiliary. They were foundational, enduring, and in several quiet instances, subtly assuming responsibilities that had traditionally belonged to the monarch himself. The advisors absorbed the implications in silence. No one verbalized the conclusion already hanging heavily in the room. This decision was not merely tactical. It was anticipatory. As documents shifted hands above stairs, Princess Anne withdrew to her private chambers, pulling the solid door closed behind her. For the first time since the news broke, she permitted herself a pause. She didn't sit. She moved deliberately, measured steps tracing the length of the room. Those who knew Anne best had long described her as immovable, forged from duty and resolve. Yet, even the most solid structures strain when asked to carry the weight of an entire institution. What unsettled her most wasn't the increased burden, nor the glare of public attention that would inevitably intensify. It was the truth beneath the decision, a truth she had grasped long before the nation sensed any instability. For months, she had noticed the changes. Charles hesitating before rising, steadying himself against furniture, drawing deeper breaths after extended appearances. Officially, nothing was said. But Anne didn't need words. A sister recognizes what others overlook. And now that silent reality had taken shape as her newly formalized role, one she had never chased, never required validation for. Obligation had always been her compass. But this moment carried a different gravity. This was the crown discreetly redistributing its burden, settling it squarely onto her frame. Anne stood near the window, eyes fixed on the winter light fading prematurely into dusk, when a gentle knock pulled her back. Catherine appeared at the door, her face composed yet edged with worry. She stepped inside without ceremony, the privilege of kin allowing honesty without words. Catherine said nothing. She simply took her place beside Anne, both women acknowledging the same unspoken reality. The monarchy was in motion, and had just become its center of balance. Elsewhere, at Clarence House, King Charles remained alone in his study, the gravity of the day pressing down like an unremovable weight. The decision had been unavoidable. He accepted that, but necessity offered no comfort against its emotional toll. In solitude, he permitted himself a rare pause, a moment of inward reckoning few rulers ever allow. His thoughts returned to, and as a child, serious beyond her years, unwavering even then. He remembered the decades she had spent shouldering the monarchy's least celebrated responsibilities without resentment, without hesitation, never seeking praise. And now, when most would step back, he had placed an even greater load upon her. His gaze settled on a photograph resting on his desk, the two of them at Balmoral, standing together shortly before their mother's death. A fleeting calm before everything changed. And now it was changing again. This time, Anne was walking into a storm he could no longer face on his own. Across the palace, William held quiet consultations with senior aides, carefully processing the long-term meaning of the king's choice. He supported it completely, yet he understood what lay beneath it. The institution was positioning and as its stabilizer in a moment of deep uncertainty. A quiet acknowledgement that the monarchy was preparing for outcomes the public had yet to imagine. The chapter ends with a moment few beyond palace walls would ever hear about. Late that night, after the corridors dimmed and silence reclaimed the halls and made her way toward the king's private study, she stopped at the threshold, drew a measured breath, and stepped inside. What they shared then, calm, candid, and quietly devastating, marked the real beginning of her new chapter. Not a rank, not an assignment, a vow. The subtle warnings no one recognized until the moment had already passed. The narrative surrounding King Charles's sobering announcement did not begin the moment it reached the public. Its origins trace back to the quiet, uneventful days that preceded it. Days that appeared routine to the outside world, yet carried a faint but undeniable change within the monarchy's inner walls. Those closest to the king sensed the earliest signals not through spectacle or abrupt disruption, but through the kinds of minor irregularities history later exposes as forewarnings. A slight stumble, a shortened appearance, a hesitation during briefings that lingered just a beat too long. None of it dramatic enough to provoke concern. All of it unmistakable to those who truly knew him. For Princess N, none of this came as a shock. She had felt the shift weeks earlier, long before advisors began drafting carefully calibrated language, and had always been the royal who looked straight through circumstances rather than skirting around them. She observed how Charles steadied himself after extended discussions, the brief rigidity that flashed across his frame, the growing selectivity in his public schedule. She asked nothing not from indifference, but from understanding. She knew her brother would preserve the institution's appearance at any cost, even his own well-being. What unsettled her most was not the physical strain alone, but the quieter withdrawal that seemed to accompany it. Behind closed doors, senior staff exchanged hushed assessments, each conversation carrying more weight than the last. Within Buckingham Palace's communications offices, advisors began charting subtle shifts in the king's workload that hinted at an unspoken recalibration. Responsibilities were reassigned earlier than usual. Statements faced heightened scrutiny. Appearances once assumed to be certain were now labeled provisional. These annotations, always discreet and deliberately understated, pointed toward a reality protocol would not allow them to articulate. The monarch was laying the foundation for a profound internal realignment. At the same time, coordination with foreign counterparts became notably more deliberate. Requests from the palace arrived with increased urgency, emphasizing adaptable scheduling and diplomatic latitude. Inside the system, analysts recognized the tightening of messaging, the kind that historically precedes decisive change. The signs were there, quiet but persistent, signaling that the monarchy was bracing itself long before the world was told why. It wasn't striking enough to trigger headlines, but for those who had witnessed royal transitions before, it was impossible to miss. Without a single public word, the monarchy was subtly shifting its center of gravity, edging toward a recalibration that would ultimately settle on Princess Anne. Through those weeks, Anne carried herself with characteristic resolve, refusing to confront the suspicion slowly taking shape inside her. She fulfilled engagements with her familiar precision, greeted crowds with unwavering calm, and sustained the tempo of royal service with a discipline few could rival. Yet beneath that composed exterior lay the growing weight of an unspoken certainty. She understood that attention would soon turn toward her, and that stepping forward would not be driven by desire, but by obligation. The next indication surfaced when senior aides began circulating unusually comprehensive contingency briefs. Written in restrained, almost sterile language, the documents mapped out scenarios for reallocating specific ceremonial responsibilities should the king need to scale back his commitments. The phrasing was cautious to the point of discomfort. Those who reviewed the papers exchanged silent looks that revealed what the text carefully avoided stating. This was not standard procedure. Planning of this nature was never casual, never speculative. It only appeared when the institution was bracing for realities the public was not yet permitted to consider. Princess Anne responded swiftly, though away from view. Her office door remained closed more often. Briefings grew longer, quieter, more deliberate. She scrutinized her own calendar with a focus that suggested methodical preparation, assembling herself piece by piece for a transition she did not welcome, yet increasingly sensed could not be avoided. There was no alarm in her demeanor, no trace of fear. Only the calm acknowledgement that the monarchy was entering a phase where her responsibilities would stretch far beyond expectation, into territory few had anticipated and fewer still were equipped to navigate. King Charles, meanwhile, continued to present the composure demanded of a reigning monarch. In public, his bearing remained assured, smiling when required, solemn when appropriate, every movement measured and dignified. But those closest to him perceived the quiet toll accumulating beneath the surface. The institution had endured mounting international strain, relentless scrutiny, and the internal weight of decisions no sovereign wishes to face. Each pressure alone was manageable. Together, they formed a burden he carried without complaint, but not without cost. By mid-November, the final indication became impossible for Anne to ignore. During a private meeting inside the study at Clarence's house, she noticed something entirely new in her brother, not physical fatigue, but a deeper exhaustion of spirit. Charles paused halfway through a briefing, not from uncertainty, but because he needed a moment to summon the strength to go on. The hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, yet it stretched long enough to solidify what she had quietly dreaded. Her brother was moving toward a choice he had postponed for as long as possible, one that would reshape the monarchy and redefine her own life at the same time. And so, while the outside world remained oblivious, the foundation of the coming declaration had already been laid. Those muted November days, filled with barely perceptible adjustments, cautious murmurs, and truths left unsaid, became the opening act to a moment that would rattle the crown itself. And at the center of that unseen turbulence stood Princess Anne, immovable, composed, awaiting a responsibility she never pursued, yet knew she would shoulder without pause. The meeting that altered everything, the instant that locked the monarchy onto a path from which it could not turn back, did not unfold beneath chandeliers or before flashing cameras. It took place in seclusion, inside a rarely used room buried within Clarence's house, a chamber so discreet that even senior aides seldom referenced it. The king demanded total privacy. No staff, no witnesses. Only a single line appeared on a small note delivered silently to Princess Anne's desk, 11:15 Clarence's house, private. And arrived exactly on time. Her stride was even, her expression carefully controlled in the way it always became when emotion threatened to rise. She understood her brother well enough to recognize when a conversation carried gravity, but even she could not foresee how completely this one would redirect her future and the institution itself. When she stepped inside, Charles was already standing near the tall window, one hand resting against the sill, as though steadying himself against the pale winter light spilling across the floor. For several seconds, neither spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was dense, the kind only siblings forged under decades of scrutiny can share. When Charles finally turned to face her and recognized it instantly, a gentleness in his eyes she had not seen since the days after their mother's death. He motioned for her to sit, yet remained standing himself, seemingly unable to settle long enough to gather his thoughts. The hesitation was uncharacteristic, and it told Anne everything she needed to know about the seriousness of what was coming. Then he spoke, quietly. There is no simple way to say what must be said. His voice remained controlled, but each word carried the weariness of someone who had reached the limits of solitary endurance. He spoke of mounting pressure, of global responsibilities growing heavier, of relentless scrutiny, of political fragility, and of a physical toll he could no longer dismiss. And listened without interruption, though instinct urged her to respond. She restrained herself. This was something her brother needed to articulate fully, on his own terms. When he reached the core of it, Charles paused once more, drawing a slow breath as if borrowing strength from the stillness around them. I must step back from certain responsibilities, he said softly. Not for a season. Not as a gesture. Permanently. The word lingered between them, heavy and final, like a stone sinking into dark water. Before she could speak, he continued. I want you to assume them. I need you to take on a role the monarchy cannot afford to leave unresolved. Anne's chest tightened, though she concealed it. She had anticipated increased demands, she always had. But this was something else entirely. This was not routine redistribution. This was a quiet handover of authority. A preparation for a future the public had not yet been told to imagine. She studied her brother's face, seeing not only a king, but a man wrestling with the most difficult truth a monarch can face, the limits of his own time. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but her words carried the gravity of the moment. If this is what must be done for the crown, then it will be done, she said. But Charles, tell me honestly, are you prepared for what this means? It was the one question he had been avoiding, not because he lacked courage, but because acknowledging it made the reality undeniable. After a long pause, he nodded. I am prepared, he said quietly. But I wish I were not. The room fell into another silence, more profound than the first. No ceremonial language, no rehearsed protocol, just a brother and a sister confronting a truth neither had wanted to face. When the meeting finally ended, and walked out with her posture straight, her steps unshaken. But inside, a storm had begun, not of fear, but of responsibility. She now carried a role that would reshape the monarchy's future. And she would carry it with the same unwavering resolve that had defined her entire life. What neither she nor Charles realized in that moment was how swiftly the world would react once the announcement reached beyond those walls. Because while the conversation remained private, the consequences were already gathering force, waiting for the moment to break into the light. The palace divided behind the doors of a tense November. In the days following the private meeting between King Charles and Princess Anne, the palace became a landscape of quiet fractures. Nothing dramatic unfolded in public. Of course, the monarchy never reveals its tension through spectacle. Instead, the strain revealed itself in the subtle ways only insiders could detect. In carefully altered schedules, in suddenly closed-door meetings, in discreet memos marked for limited circulation. Buckingham Palace had entered a period of controlled uncertainty, a moment when every decision carried the weight of far more than its surface meaning. The first ripples appeared within the senior staff. Advisors who had grown accustomed to Charles's hands-on oversight found themselves receiving instructions through intermediaries more frequently. Tasks that once required the king's direct review were now routed through Princess Anne's office quietly and without ceremony. No official announcement had been made yet, but the machinery of the institution was already shifting its balance toward her. Those who had served both the late queen and the current king recognized the pattern instantly. This was not a delegation. This was a transition. Inside the communications wing, a different kind of tension was taking shape. Analysts tasked with monitoring public sentiment noticed an unusual rise in speculation surrounding the royal family's winter schedule. Rumors circulated about postponed appearances, scale-back engagements, and last-minute adjustments. None of these were catastrophic individually, but taken together, they painted a picture of instability. The palace had survived turbulent winters before, but this one, marked by careful secrecy and sudden caution, felt different. It felt as though the institution was bracing itself for an announcement the world had not yet been prepared to absorb. Princess Anne, for her part, moved with a brisk decisiveness that belied the emotional weight she carried. She attended briefings with unusual precision, asking pointed questions, recalibrating timelines, and taking on responsibilities that once belonged to her brother. Staff described her tone as sharper than usual, not out of irritation, but out of necessity. She was building the infrastructure required to assume duties she had never sought, but could not refuse. And though she remained outwardly composed, those closest to her observed that she lingered longer in her office at night, reviewing documents alone after the corridors fell silent. Meanwhile, Prince William found himself at the intersection of two conflicting realities. On one hand, he fully supported Anne's expanded role. He trusted her judgment, admired her discipline, and knew she was the only royal capable of stabilizing the institution during a delicate period. But on the other hand, he understood the unspoken implication of the king's decision. Charles was preparing for a future in which he might no longer stand at the helm of the monarchy with the same strength he once did. This reality weighed heavily on William, a man who had spent the last year carrying the burden of succession with increasing clarity. During one particularly tense meeting inside Kensington Palace, William reviewed the updated protocol briefing that listed Princess Anne as the designated senior representative for several upcoming engagements traditionally reserved for the monarch. The list was not long, but its symbolism was unmistakable. It included state events, military inspections, and diplomatic receptions, responsibilities that signaled a shift from supportive participation to structural leadership. When the meeting ended, William remained seated at the table, hands folded, staring at the document long after others had left. For the first time, he could no longer deny what was coming. Queen Camilla, meanwhile, carried her own silent burden. She had lived through the most brutal chapters of royal scrutiny. She understood the ruthless nature of public narrative better than anyone inside the institution. So, when the king informed her of his conversation with Anne, she did not respond with shock. Instead, her reaction was a quiet, devastating understanding. She knew that Charles had made his decision not out of weakness, but out of love. Love for the crown, for stability, and for the family he hoped to secure before circumstances forced his hand. She stepped into a discreet but influential role in the days that followed. Camilla coordinated with senior aides to ensure that the transition and responsibilities would appear seamless when revealed to the public. She offered support to, and without overstepping, understanding that the princess valued independence above comfort. And she shielded Charles from unnecessary pressure, creating a buffer around him that allowed him moments of rest he would never request for himself. While all this unfolded, palace insiders noted a growing divide between those prepared for the upcoming announcement and those unaware of its magnitude. Long-serving staff recognized the echoes of 1952 and 2022, years when the monarchy adjusted its footing under the shadow of inevitability. Younger aides, however, sensed tension without fully understanding its cause, interpreting the increased urgency as mere winter pressure. They did not yet realize that the institution was undergoing one of the most significant internal recalibrations since the late Queen's declining years. By mid-November, the palace reached a point of collective stillness. Every department, from communications to protocol, from security to scheduling, moved with the quiet precision of people preparing for impact. They did not know the exact date the king would speak publicly, but they knew it was approaching. They could feel it in the way senior briefings had become shorter, in the way Anne's presence had become central, and in the way Charles himself seemed to carry a softer, more reflective demeanor. The monarchy had entered a winter of truth. A season in which every unspoken concern, every hidden strain, every whispered conversation converged toward a single unavoidable moment. And as the month drew to a close, that moment stood just ahead, waiting for the king to step forward and speak words that would alter the course of the family, the institution, and Princess Anne's life forever. The announcement that shook Britain before sunrise. The morning King Charles finally stepped forward to speak was one Britain would remember for decades. Not because it arrived with fanfare, but because of the stillness that preceded it. It was just past 6:40 when the first hint of frost settled across the lawns of Buckingham Palace, coating the stone railings in a thin icy sheen. London was barely awake. Streetlights still flickered. Buses hummed softly through half-empty routes, and only the earliest commuters were out, bracing against the bitter air. No one knew that within minutes the monarchy would issue one of its most consequential messages since the late Queen's final years. At 6:47, the palace press office released a statement so concise, so stark that senior correspondents reread it twice to confirm they had not misunderstood its meaning. In deliberate, measured phrasing, the king announced a permanent restructuring of senior royal duties. He confirmed Princess Anne's elevation to a newly formalized role, one historically reserved for the monarch's most trusted anchor during moments of institutional transition. It was not framed as temporary assistance. It was not described as a provisional measure. It was permanent, strategic, and tied explicitly to the stability of the crown. Within 90 seconds, major broadcasters cut into their programming. On BBC Breakfast, the presenter hesitated mid-sentence, glancing at the breaking banner with visible shock. Sky News shifted instantly to a live desk. In Edinburgh, a commuter reportedly stopped walking entirely, staring at her phone as though the screen might offer a different interpretation of the words. Across the Atlantic, where it was just after 1 o'clock in the morning on the East Coast, American anchors on channels News Network and Columbia Broadcasting System scrambled to frame the significance of the announcement. The question repeated across every network was the same. What prompted such a drastic move? The phrasing of the statement provided no detail about the king's health, yet its tone told a story all its own. Royal announcements are typically cushioned with diplomacy, acknowledgments of service, references to tradition, and nods to shared responsibilities. This one carried none of that. It was clinical, precise, and weighted with the unmistakable gravity of irreversible change. Analysts quickly noted the most telling line. Her Royal Highness will assume a defined senior role in sustaining the crown's operational responsibilities going forward. Not temporarily, not for the winter, for the foreseeable future. Inside Clarence House, King Charles remained in his study as reactions poured in. He had chosen not to appear on camera. The decision had cost him emotionally, but he knew the palace needed clarity more than sentiment. He understood that silence had created too much room for speculation, and he also understood that Anne's acceptance of the role signaled a profound shift not only within the institution, but within the family itself. As for Princess Anne, she did not watch the announcement unfold. Instead, she stood in a quiet corridor overlooking the palace gardens, hands clasped behind her back, absorbing the weight of a responsibility she had never sought but could not refuse. She knew the world would interpret this moment in countless ways, politically, historically, emotionally. But to her, it was something simpler, something heavier. It was a duty. It was permanent. And it was the beginning of a chapter that would redefine the monarchy's future in ways the public had only begun to understand. The world reacts shock waves across a changing monarchy. The hours following the King's Dawn announcement unfolded like a global echo, each region reacting in its own way, each interpretation sharpening the magnitude of what had just occurred. In Britain, the reaction was immediate and deeply emotional. Radio call-ins filled with voices trembling between concern and resignation. Many older listeners compared the moment to the winter transitions of the 1990s and early 2000s, recalling how subtle palace shifts had often preceded seismic changes. Younger viewers, meanwhile, flooded social platforms with disbelief, questioning how a figure as steadfast as Princess Anne had suddenly become the monarchy's central pillar. By mid-morning, newspapers rushed to finalize their midday editions. Headlines ranged from "A new era begins" to "What the palace isn't saying." Analysts wasted no time dissecting the announcement's tone, highlighting its unusual bluntness and the absence of reassuring phrasing. One British Broadcasting Corporation correspondent noted that the statement read less like a routine reassignment and more like a structural rebalancing of power. Another observed that the palace had effectively confirmed and as the monarchy's operational stabilizer, a position rarely invoked unless the sovereign faced mounting constraints. Across Europe, diplomatic channels quietly sought clarification, not officially, never officially, but through the discreet inquiries that always follow unexpected royal news. Several ambassadors requested updated protocol guidance, unsure whether upcoming state engagements would now be led by the king or by Princess Anne. The Foreign Office issued a calm, rehearsed line. All commitments remain unchanged. Yet internally, the shift in tone was unmistakable. Anne's new role was already shaping international perception. In the United States, commentators framed the development through a different lens. Major networks emphasized Anne's reputation for discipline and integrity, describing her as the monarchy's most unshakable force. But beneath the praise lay another narrative, one questioning whether the king's decision signaled deeper concerns behind palace walls. Analysts debated the quiet efficiency with which Anne had stepped into increased visibility over recent weeks, concluding that the public had been witnessing a controlled transition without realizing it. Back in London, the palace itself moved with choreographed precision. Meetings were recalibrated. Schedules were redrafted. Departments adjusted their operational chains to reflect Anne's new authority. The shift was subtle but undeniable, a gentle tilting of the monarchy toward a new axis. And yet, amid all the analysis and speculation, one truth remained clear. This moment was not about ambition. It was not about politics. It was about preservation. The crown, sensing vulnerability, had placed its weight in the one person capable of carrying it without wavering. Princess Anne had become the monarchy's shield, and the world watching in real time understood just how significant that transformation truly